There are few engines with as much name recognition as the Hellcat V8. And with that powertrain being discontinued this year, we are going to talk through all of the different vehicles that engine was featured in and talk about, in general, what made this powertrain so iconic. We can trace the origins of the Hellcat engine all the way back to the 1950s when Chrysler came out with their Hemi brand of engines. This engine design was a pushrod overhead valve V8. And it got the Hemi name from the fact that it featured a hemispherical combustion chamber. Without getting too technical, this means that it has a domed cylinder head, and at the top of the stroke, the piston encloses a space that is roughly equivalent to half a sphere. Some advantages to this type of design were that it allowed the engine to feature two large valves. That meant it could breathe a lot better than other engines at the time, and it was also more efficient in terms of heat loss. Now, Chrysler is not the only company that leveraged the Hemi design. Other car companies such as Ford, Nissan, or Aston Martin also produced their own version of Hemi engines, but undoubtedly the Chrysler version is the most well-known. One quick side note, I will be referencing the Chrysler group here as kind of the parent company for Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, although that's changed hands several times now, it's Stellantis. And it is a little ironic that the Hellcat engine was never actually put in a Chrysler branded product, but for simplicity's sake, Chrysler Group is the parent company for all of these brands. So back to the Hemi. Chrysler had discontinued their Hemi V8 sometime in the 1970s and then brought it back in 2003. Once it was brought back, they continued to refine it until it was ultimately discontinued in 2024. We can really credit the development of the Hellcat engine to this kind of return of the muscle car that happened in the late 2000s. So in 2005, Ford came out with the 5th generation Mustang that featured retro styling. In 2008, Dodge brought back the Challenger, and then ultimately in 2010, Chevy brought back the Camaro. And not long after all of these cars were brought back, there was a brewing horsepower war with these American auto manufacturers. In 2010, Ford rolled out its 550 horsepower Shelby GT500. In 2011, Chevy one-upped them with their 580 horsepower Camaro ZL1, only to be beat out again by Ford when they rolled out their 662 horsepower 2013 GT500. And at the time, Chrysler was kind of sitting on the sidelines a little bit, with the most powerful engine that they were producing being the 6.4 liter Hemi that made a measly 470 horsepower. But there were rumblings that Chrysler was working on a far more powerful engine. After several years of development, in 2014, Chrysler revealed what they had been working on, the Hellcat engine. A 6.2 liter supercharged V8 that made 707 horsepower. This made the Challenger Hellcat the 6th most powerful vehicle on sale, and the only vehicle that made over 700 horsepower that cost less than $300,000. And let's pause on that name for a moment too, the Hellcat. The Hellcat engine was named after the Grumman F6F Hellcat, which was a fighter pilot used in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And undoubtedly, we can credit this name, at least in part, for making the Hellcat engine so iconic. The first vehicle that Chrysler decided to put the Hellcat engine in was the Challenger. At the time, this was the car that just made the most sense. It most directly competed with the Mustang and the Camaro, and it immediately one-upped anything that these companies had on sale. And to put it in context of that horsepower war I was talking about, Chevy never made a mass production Camaro that was more powerful than that 2015 Hellcat. And it took Ford until 2020 to come out with a vehicle that was more powerful than the original Hellcat in the form of the Mustang GT500. But of course, by then, Dodge had already reset the standard by coming out with vehicles like the Demon or the Red Eye variants. Just a few months after the launch of the Challenger Hellcat, Dodge introduced the Charger Hellcat. Of course, this car got the same supercharged V8, and it immediately made it the fastest sedan ever produced with a top speed of 203 miles per hour. And it's hard to overstate just how big of an impact these vehicles had at launch. For around $60,000, you were getting something that was more powerful than some of the entry-level offerings from exotic car manufacturers like McLaren or Lamborghini, and let alone beating out the other American muscle cars like the ZL1 and the GT500. And nobody really cared that the Hellcat was built on a platform that was nearly a decade old and might not have the luxuries of something like an M3 or a Mercedes-AMG C63. All that mattered was that you had a 700 horsepower V8 and they did not. So after 3 years of Hellcat production is where things got interesting. Chrysler noticed a general shift in the market towards SUVs and noticed an opportunity. See, there was a group of these high-performance SUVs that were starting to pop up with vehicles like the X3 and X5M and the Porsche Cayenne Turbo. And while Chrysler already had the Jeep SRT8 that competed with these vehicles, they knew that there was room for more. So in 2018, they introduced the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk. And while it didn't feature Hellcat in the name, we all know what the powertrain was. And I would give the Trackhawk a lot of credit for some of these crazy, super high-performance SUVs that we're seeing today. Aston Martin has a high-performance SUV, even Lamborghini and now Ferrari all have these super powerful SUVs. 2021 was another big year for the Hellcat with the introduction of 2 new models. The first, and admittedly less interesting of the two, was the Dodge Durango SRT. I think that this is likely the least loved out of all the Hellcat versions. The Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk really caught everybody's attention by being the first SUV to feature the Hellcat powertrain, and the Dodge Durango was essentially just a bigger, heavier version of that, which could have been the reason why Dodge was only planning on producing the Durango SRT for 1 model year. Of course, they then did produce it again in 2023 and got sued by a bunch of their customers, but that is a story for another day. Now, the other model that came out in 2023 was the Ram TRX. And I think the TRX really goes to show you that Chrysler Group, maybe more than any other automaker, knows how to give the people what they want. Now, high-performance pickup trucks are nothing new. We can look back and see vehicles like the GMC Cyclone, the Ford F-150 Lightning, or the Ram SRT-10. But these were all street-oriented pickups that never really caught on. It wasn't until 2010 when Ford came out with the Raptor. That was the time when the high-performance pickup truck really solidified its place in the market, with the big differentiator being that it was an off-roader. In 2017, Ford came out with the second generation of the Raptor, but this time it featured a downsized turbo V6 opposed to the V8. While this new EcoBoost V6 featured more power than the outgoing V8, people were still up in arms. And this is likely where Chrysler Group noticed an opportunity for an even more high performance and even more upmarket pickup truck with the Ram TRX. And while it costed more than a Raptor, you got a lot for your money with a myriad of off-road enhancements and, of course, the supercharged Hellcat V8. So those are the 5 mass production Hellcat powered vehicles. Now, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about some of the reasons why this powertrain became so iconic. First and foremost, I think there's just the value. This amount of power for a relatively approachable price was something that really was revolutionary. While vehicles like the GT500 offered a similar level of power, I think there's something in human psychology where we see that the horsepower starts with a 7 opposed to a 6, and it's like an exponential amount more. The second reason is that for a lot of these Hellcat-powered vehicles, they completely reshaped the segments that they entered into. Like right off of the bat with the Challenger and Charger Hellcat, Dodge essentially planted their flag as being the winners of the horsepower wars. They basically blew up the high-performance SUV market with the introduction of the Jeep Grand Cherokee Trackhawk. And they shifted the entire high-performance pickup truck market upwards with the introduction of the Ram TRX. And Ford just recently had to come out with their response in the form of the Ford Raptor R. And the last reason I'll touch on is just that the Hellcat had some really good marketing. The Hellcat name itself is an incredible piece of branding, but it's not just that. The commercials and how they advertised these vehicles, they ended up being in a way that just resonated with a lot of people. So while the Hellcat engine did have an amazing run, it has been discontinued as of 2024. And there were a few different reasons for this. The first is that the Hellcat engine is just plain inefficient. Some of the vehicles that we're talking about, they averaged like mid to high teens for fuel economy. And as emissions and fuel economy standards just continued to get stricter and stricter, the Hellcat engine wasn't going to be around for much longer. Now, I do think that they could have continued producing the Hellcat engine for a few more years, but the second reason was basically the nail in the coffin. And that was that a lot of these Hellcat models were just plain old. For example, the Charger and Challenger are built on a platform that is nearly 20 years old, and it wasn't super advanced at the time that it originally came out either. And vehicles like the Jeep Grand Cherokee just got a refresh. So it wouldn't make a ton of sense for Chrysler to continue producing the Hellcat V8 and put it into their next generation of cars, just to then kill it off a year or two later. You do have to credit Chrysler, though, by kind of seizing on this opportunity by coming out with all of these crazy special edition last call models. They certainly made the most of that opportunity. If you made it this far, let me know down in the comments what your favorite Hellcat version was, and I'll see you in the next video.